I'm really pleased to be here today with Marc Angelucci. He's one of the great heroes of the men's rights movement, a lawyer who's fought and won big anti-discrimination cases on behalf of men. Hello, Marc.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're talking, you're in Los Angeles and I'm in Sydney, so there's probably going to be a few delays here and there. We'll see how we go. I first met Marc at the International Conference on Men's Issues, which was in 2017 on the Gold Coast here in Australia. And I was then involved with looking after Cassie Jaye, the filmmaker who made The Red Pill, and I was trying to protect her from a ferocious anti-male media. We then, both of us had the thrill of attending Cassie's wedding last year. Marc, I'm going to show a photo of us with Warren Farrell, who of course is another of the hero of the men's rights movement. Let's go back. I want to talk about some of your achievements, but starting off, how you got involved in all of this. I gather you had a very good friend, who was in a violent relationship, and you tried to find a refuge for him and his children.
Yeah, that was when I was a law student at UCLA back in 1998. My very good friend, who I grew up with, he and his wife both drink too much, functioning alcoholics. But when he's drunk, he becomes kind of an annoying, happy drunk.
Yeah.
Talks too much. And her, on the other hand, I don't know why, but sometimes becomes really violent and throws things, breaks things, hits him. And she's my friend. It's not like I'm putting her down, but I've seen her do it a number of times, and she just hits him, and sometimes uses weapons. I don't know what it is. She's even directed it towards others, and even once toward me.
Yeah.
When she was slitting her wrists, and I went up to try to stop her, and then she punched me. It's just something that triggers when she's drunk, and so he would call me because he's drunk. He's not going to drive. Sometimes he would go outside when there's loud noise or things breaking, so the neighbors can see that it's not him. He would call her parents to come and bring the kids away. But then who else? He would call me while I'm a law student. I was busy, so eventually I said, "You need help," and I called around. And there was just nothing. Over and over, they'd say, we don't help male victims here. Most of them didn't even give me a referral anywhere else. Some of them did. They referred me to Valley Oasis way out in the desert, who we've known for a long time, and that they have a whole history where they changed their policy in the 80s to have one house for male victims, and they are state-funded. And all the places I called were state-funded, as far as I know.
Yeah.
But they're very far away, and they received a lot of help from the other, I don't want to say all the other shelters, but about 3 or 4 of them that were very powerful bullies in the LA County industry, domestic violence industry. And so the others just wouldn't, say anything, but these 3 or 4 were very mean and would ostracize her. Patricia Overberg was the director at the time. She's the one who changed the policy. They had about 11 houses. They set aside one of them for male victims, and that was just anathema to these other shelter groups who didn't want men.
But that was really too far away for your friend to go to, wasn't it?
Well, that too. Yeah, it was way far away, and by the time I even learned of it was probably too late.
Yeah.
So I just started researching that more because my friend, they have minor kids who call me Uncle Mark, and I was getting concerned about them too because they are witnessing this, they're around it, and subjected to it, and I mean it just I couldn't help wondering where can he go and why is no one helping him and his kids just because he's male.
Yeah.
So
you got involved.
I had heard.
Yeah.
I got involved. I hadn't read Warren Farrell yet, but when I was an undergrad, about 3 years before that, at Berkeley, I read a book there by Ellis Coase called A Man's World: How Real is Male Privilege and How High is the Price. And he's not an MRA, but he was somewhat sympathetic to the men's rights movement and Warren Farrell. And basically the book was saying, look, they've got some good issues, even if sometimes they go overboard. And so I had already heard a little bit about some of these issues, but it didn't really trigger until this happened while I was a law student. And it just got me fired up because it is happening to a friend of mine. And this is just going to continue like this. He's not going to go get any help. I mean, it was hard for me to try to convince him even to go to a shelter. But one that's an hour away in the desert with his kids, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah. So you ended up joining this organization, which was originally called National Coalition of Free Men, and worked for almost 10 years fighting anti-discrimination. Is that right?
Oh, I've been with them for 20 years now. I joined around that time. Around that time, I started looking online for like battered men, things like that, and then men's rights. And I looked up all these groups, and I started calling people. I talked to Warren Farrell briefly. I talked to others, and I saw this group kept popping up called Free Men, something Free Men. And so eventually I looked into them, and it was interesting because others mostly focused either on fathers or on male victims or something like that, and this one sort of focused on all men's rights issues, and I liked that, although I didn't really know much about all of them. But I joined them, and I also joined SAFE, Stop Abuse for Everyone, but eventually that kind of fell apart. I joined them, and I started talking to the president, Tom Williamson, on the phone, and I started reading Warren Farrell's books, The Myth of Male Power and the other ones, and it just really transformed me so much that I started publishing articles in the law school newspaper at UCLA called The Docket and in the UCLA Daily Bruin on these issues, and then other issues that I was learning about, like sentencing disparities by gender that my law school professors weren't talking about when they would talk about racial disparities in sentencing. And the gender or sex disparities are even larger and even more provable because the research is more solid on them. And so I started speaking out, and the reactions were just kind of, I mean, people were a little shocked. Some people were supportive but wanted to be quiet about it. I have a feminist who I knew, who I was in the study groups with, come up and say, Mark, I've read your articles. I know what you're saying. I get it. You just believe men need equal rights, but you need to know that there are a lot of reactionaries out there. And I mean, I knew that, but hearing it from her was very powerful.
It's a very funny thought, Mark, that the reactionaries, of course, are the feminists. I mean, in the sense that they're trying to hang on to their power, which is the great irony in all this, isn't it?
Yeah, and always misframing when they frame your position, always misframing what it's about, very rarely ever even listening. And this one happened to have been my friend, and a very intelligent one who even though she and I would disagree, she was rational enough to come up and tell me that and to actually listen to or read what I was saying.
Yeah.
But most of them were not.
So you did this big anti-discrimination case. I want you to tell people about that. Over lack of support for male domestic violence victims.
While I was still a law student, Patricia Overberg, the director of Valley Oasis, told me, Mark, we need a lawsuit. We need a civil rights lawsuit. And I noted that, and I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't know that I ever could do it, but I never forgot it. And eventually she passed away. But at some point after I founded the LA chapter and got a good group going, and I was present for about 10 years, we were very, very active. But one of the things I wanted to do was that lawsuit. And so we tried it in several different ways at first that initially failed, like with civil rights testers. A lot of men didn't want their names out in the media. Suing is just a scary thing for them. And so it wasn't an easy thing to do. But eventually we got 4 men, one in L.A., actually 2 in L.A. One was in a wheelchair, 2 from Northern California, one from Sacramento and one from Grass Valley. And all 4 of them had been victims at some point and sought help from their local state-funded program. And I emphasize state-funded because it's taxed because as men are paying these taxes that support these shelter programs, and all of them were denied. We're told, no, we don't help men. So we filed a lawsuit in Sacramento for strategic reasons under the Equal Protection Clause of the California Constitution, and there are legal reasons for that, strategic reasons for doing that instead of in federal court that we did that. So, I mean, that was like a big, huge battle. We even sued some of the shelters. Ultimately, we reached some settlements with the shelters. Wasn't an easy lawsuit with the shelters because you had to prove they still were discriminating, and they were swearing that they weren't, even though they were. But we reached a settlement with some of them, and they really did. The settlements are confidential, but I can tell you the changes they made afterwards were very good. And one of them was getting $4 million a year, half of it public fund, private, half of it from government. And they really did change. I give them credit for that. They had one of our experts go train their staff on the statistics. They created group sessions for men. They started they created housing, or at least hotel vouchers for men when they didn't have room, things like that. But those were only a few of them. And then we continued against the state of California because what we found was the law, the Health and Safety Code, specifically described domestic violence victims as only being women for purposes of the funding, not so much for criminal. We know that even though that's neutral, there's still bias in how it's administered. But this was actually specifically in the law, written into it. And nobody had ever challenged it, when the feminist groups go in there and change everything to neutral, except things like that. They leave it alone. And so we sued, and it was a long battle. The lower court judge, the state court judge, said he sympathized. He said, I've seen male victims in my court, but I'm afraid that if I grant this, I'll have to invalidate the whole statute and everything. And he was wrong about that. There is an alternative way to do it called judicial reformation. And he didn't listen when I explained it to him. So we had to appeal it. I appealed it the very next day. I was furious. I couldn't believe it when I read that.
But you won that appeal.
We won the appeal. It took over a year, maybe even 2 years. But we did, and it got reversed. There was a very intense oral argument. And all three of the appellate judges sided with us and said, yes, male victims. Now, they didn't. The decision could have been a little harder hitting than it was, but it was still very good. It said, male victims can be similarly situated with female victims, and there's no basis to discriminate. These shelters have to provide something. And then it gave them a little way out by saying this is what they're hanging on to, and we think we need another lawsuit. They gave one way out that said, well, if you can't provide exactly the same services, for example, if your shelter's small and you can't fit and you can't mix the genders in this small little house or something, well, you can at least provide a hotel voucher. And so the way, and I mean, I agree with that, but the way we're learning now that the way some counties and programs are interpreting that is that means, well, okay, you can give a voucher, but that's just one example of an alternative. You can also refer them somewhere else. And so, like in LA County, that's how the LA County Council is interpreting that on purpose, of course, politically. That means that all they have to do is say, well, you can go to Valley Oasis, and that they've sufficiently helped the male victims, not even giving them legal services, counseling, nothing. Just go to Valley Oasis.
That's the same thing all the time. They're up to their usual tricks of trying to get out of providing services for men. What is the norm now in America? Are more services genuinely opening up for men, or is there still this entrenched attitude of trying to find ways out of it?
I think it's more the latter, but we do see some improvement here and there. Now, after the Woods case, we did see improvement in California, but it reached a certain point and then stopped, and didn't go any further than that. And what we're seeing in some counties is still horrible, like in LA. So I think
I mean, this is about the money, isn't it? I mean, as Erin Pizzey is the famous woman who started the first refuge for women in London, and then got into trouble for speaking out about the fact that a lot of the women coming to that refuge were violent, and there's a lot of violent women who are violent towards their children and towards their partners. And she ended up being hounded out, threatened, having to leave Britain. Now, Erin has been arguing for years and years that this is the domestic violence is the big cash cow for women, for the feminist movement, and they're desperate to lock men out because they don't want to lose that huge source of funding. I mean, do you think that's right?
I think that's absolutely correct. It's a combination of that and ideology, because a lot of the people who work even at the lower level in these shelters also come from feminist background. And so they too want to see it, and their argument is always, well, we don't have enough funding, so if we allow a male victim in, that takes the place of a woman. Well, I mean, that's just completely discriminatory. You can imagine that kind of argument by race. And look who's being hurt the most by all this are the children, of course. And they admit that, but they just don't have much in response.
I'll tell you the great irony, Mark.
Was getting $4 million a year. That's not a small amount. I'm sorry.
No,
go ahead.
No, that's what I was just going to say. The great irony in Australia, we've got exactly the same situation. No funding for men. In fact, we had one of our state ministers for domestic violence, great fanfare, made a big announcement she was going to give the first ever funding for male victims. And then she gave that funding to an organisation which prides itself on deciding which of the alleged victims are actually perpetrators.
Really?
I mean, it was such a joke. But we have no funding for men. Do you ever hear from Australia? I mean, I would love to find Australian lawyers to fight these cases. Have you ever heard of anyone here who's interested?
I have not. No, I've only been there once, actually. I had a great time out there at that conference, but I just don't know of any. No. I'm sorry.
Well, let me know. If anyone comes out of the woodwork, let me know. But we've got the same problem. We've got one group trying to start a men's shelter up in Queensland. We're trying to get funding for that. But, I mean, it's a dire situation. Anyway, well, we need to move on, Mark. So, I mean, that was, I think, one of your big achievements. But the other one has been the battles you've been fighting on the conscription cases. The fact that in America, all 18-year-old males have to register with Selective Service. You better explain for our Australian audience a bit more about what are the consequences of that. What does that actually mean?
Well, at this point, the judge has ruled that it's unconstitutional to force only males but not females to register. The judge did not give an injunctive order. An injunction would mean you are required to change right now. The judge just gave what's called declaratory relief, meaning that they've declared that this is unconstitutional. But I think the judge just wanted to give the government more time. So, of course, the Selective Service appealed it.
Can I just go back to, I don't think people in Australia would realise what this, I mean, this is not about, obviously you haven't had conscription for a while now, but all 18-year-olds still have to register, and there are some implications for that. I mean, if a male doesn't register, he can't get student loans. Explain what happens to a male if he doesn't
they can be jailed. I believe it's up to 5 years. Sometimes I forget the exact numbers, but they can be jailed. They can be fined. And in fact, and it has happened to, we know that it has happened to a certain number of men. There have been lawsuits. They can lose their federal jobs or be denied federal jobs. And actually, those are the ones that we've seen a number of. There have been lawsuits on that basis. One guy was homeless when he was of draft age, and then years later he turned his life around, got a federal job, worked there for decades, and suddenly they learned he's not registered, and they fired him. That's the Elgin case. So there's all kinds of consequences, and not just at the federal level. A lot of states have their own laws that connect Selective Service registration to driver's licenses and things like that. All kinds of things. So it's much more than just those. And the court. Sorry, I gather the courts were arguing this wasn't discrimination against men, that only men have to do it, because
the same conditions didn't apply to women. Women weren't allowed into combat. But then that changed. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. That. Yeah. So in the late 70s, these 4 men sued, did the same kind of lawsuit as us, and said, this is discrimination, and the lower court sided with them, but the Supreme Court reversed it and said, well, there's no equal protection issue here because women are not allowed in combat, and therefore you're not similarly situated. There was a vigorous dissent from Justice Thurgood Marshall and 3 other judges. And in fact, we know that during World War II, they almost drafted women as nurses. That's on the Selective Service website. So the draft doesn't even have to be about combat. And the National Coalition for Men, who I'm doing all of this on behalf of, and I'm vice president of, we don't take a position on women in combat. But our position is just if women are going to be allowed in combat, and there's draft registration that's mandatory, then it needs to be both or neither.
Yeah.
It's got to go both ways. There's equal rights and there's equal responsibilities. So, I've heard a lot of things about the controversy surrounding women in combat and all that, but that's not the position we're taking. But yes, all these penalties that can happen, and I know a number of men who just feel very angry when they register that it's only because they're male that they have to do this.
Yeah.
Some people, I know a number of them who even aside from the penalties, and I do get calls. We, the NCFM, gets calls from people, from young men who are applying for a college, and the college is giving them hell because they have to prove they registered, and then they have to go dig up records, and they miss the deadline, things like that.
Yeah.
So there's that issue too. And I have one guy just recently called me a week ago about that. I've talked to him. So I'm going to help him out in whatever way I can.
This is sort of pending developments at the moment. You've won the most recent round with a federal judge calling the current system unconstitutional, but you're waiting on what now?
Well, the Selective Service, the federal government, has filed an appeal.
Yeah.
So that, in other words, they're challenging that judge, and this case is actually in Houston, Texas, which started out in L.A., and for complicated jurisdictional reasons got transferred out there. But so they're appealing up to what's called the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal, and we just filed our response brief. So at this point, we're just waiting to hear what happens. And unfortunately, our federal courts can take a long time to make decisions unless it's a criminal case or death penalty. Otherwise, they sometimes take a long time, especially if it's not a criminal case. Like civil cases, they can really drag their feet. And so we might not hear anything for a year, possibly up to 2. Although you never know. We just don't know.
How do you do all this, Mark? You've done this sort of work for years and years and years working pro bono. I don't know how you've survived.
Well, you're right. I'm a little concerned myself right now because I'm handling the big crazy case up in Mariposa right now that is just horrible. This falsely accused man, it just snowballed.
Is that a rape case?
The Jerry Cox case.
The Jerry Cox case.
Yeah.
I was going to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
If anyone doesn't know about Jerry Cox, I was just listening to a interview Karen Strawn did with Jerry Cox. Tell us about Jerry Cox, Mark.
Well, he's a rancher up in Mariposa, which is near Yosemite National Park, and it's a small county that has kind of a history of corruption. 2020 even did a story on it once. But he's a guy who had a dream of having his own ranch, so eventually he bought a 500-acre ranch, and he built these log cabins with his own hands using wood just from the property. Beautiful log cabins, absolutely gorgeous ranch. I've been up there. I've seen it, and he started using it for agritourism, which was legal under the county code, which means people can stay there and they pay him to stay on the ranch for a while. the county, for a period of time, the county was going after him over little violations here and there, but they never came to court for a long time because I guess they just didn't consider the issues big enough. He would fix some of them, but others he would dispute them, and it went on for a while. Well, he started dating this woman that he met on a website, and they got into an argument when she made a mess in the cabin and wouldn't clean it, and she got really furious while she was drunk and left and went to the police and claimed that he had locked her up for 3 days on the ranch and raped her and sodomized her those 3 days. And even when he left, she was locked in and couldn't get out. Just this incredible allegations that were just absolutely false. And he was immediately arrested.
I mean, there were people present during this time. It's amazing. He had an alibi, he had witnesses, and they never looked at any of that evidence, did they?
Well, they didn't. Initially, they didn't even take her cell phone and his cell phone to do a forensic download. They eventually did, and the evidence completely exonerated him, but they didn't at first. And so they arrested him and charged him with so many felonies that he faced life in prison. And so while he's, trying to bail himself out of jail and selling his bison so he can pay the criminal defense attorney, the county went and raided his ranch, and they just concocted all these violations. They were really either completely bogus, like a steel bridge that they said was substandard, but it was owned by the state, and they didn't know that. The state inspects it every year. They use it for fire trucks, but they didn't know that, so they wrote substandard. And but others were just little things, but they exaggerated them, and then they rushed to court and got him ejected. They didn't even first ask for an order that he repair them. They just got him ejected. They said, look, he's being charged with all these rape charges and all that, and so the judge just said, okay, ejected him from his property, and put a receiver on there, which is somebody who is in charge of managing the property when you're not on it. And the receiver was supposed to get bids on the repairs, but didn't do it. So Jerry was not allowed on his property for over a year. And finally, the criminal case was dismissed when they finally did a forensic download of the phones and saw all these text messages between them during those 3 days where there's clearly she was not being locked up and raped. She's calling him doll, and they're asking, what's your ETA and things. And also she testified in a workers' compensation case that she had not been raped or sexually assaulted. She didn't know we would get hold of that deposition, but we did. And so it got dismissed, but by that time it didn't matter. It snowballed, and here he was ejected from his property, and the receiver, instead of doing repairs and getting bids, is just racking up legal fees, putting armed guards on the property who are charging, of course. And
it's amazing, Kate. Listening to all of this, Mark, I was thinking, what you need is this should end up as a Netflix, one of their huge hits. Don't you think?
Yeah, well, it might one day somewhere because there's so many other aspects to the story. I'm really summarizing it, but
I know. But it's an amazing case. People should have a look at this. They
ordered the sale of his property. They just ordered his property sold.
Oh, it's just incredible.
Even though he had fixed all the violations, only for $8,000, he fixed them all, and he hasn't violated a single court order. But they've now ordered the property sold to pay the $700,000 in legal fees of this receiver. It's insane.
It's all insane. And, we had a fantastic case here earlier this year involving a woman called Sarah Jane Parkinson. Same sort of thing, in a way, a false rape accusation. A long story, a 5-year battle where the parent, the accused was a young man who was a prison guard. And, of course, he ends up in prison, which is a really dangerous place for an ex-screw, And then, it's all about the fact that she's having an affair with a policeman. And then this policeman helps her with cooking up all these false rape and false violence accusations. But in the end, the parents spend their whole life savings defending their son. and she was sent to prison. It's been an extraordinary story. I must send you some details. But I mean, these big cases are important because they highlight what's going on. There's so many men, I'm sure, across America, across Australia, who are being falsely accused. And one of the things that interests me is, I know you are interested in the statistics on false rape accusations. Can you give me some summary of that? What your reading is on that issue?
Well, from what I've seen, it really varies, and of course, it's really hard to measure something like that. In fact, that's something I don't think we'll ever be able to have a reliable number on. The highest I've seen are about 60%. Of course, it came from the U.S. Air Force. They did a study, but most of these studies are small in terms of numbers, in terms of sample size, but they still are, still they point in a certain direction. They tell you something. And the Air Force study was done very interestingly. They interviewed women anonymously who had made accusations, and 20-something% of them admitted that it was a lie. And then when they brought in some evaluators to look at more factors, those evaluate when all three evaluators thought it was a lie based on everything else that they've read, the number jumped up to 60%. So whether it's 30 or 60 or 25 or what, there are other studies too, some that were done at a university and in a small county. Dr. Kalin, I believe his name was, who feminists love when he did research on rape numbers, but as soon as he did research on false rape accusations, they ignored him and ostracized him, just like they did to Murray Strauss and Gellis.
I mean, that's the thing. Sorry, Mark. The feminists are constantly promoting statistics on false rape accusations, claiming, it hardly ever happens. They dig out.
Oh, I know that. The 2% number is absolutely basis. There's bogus. There's no basis for that at all. Yeah. The lowest number that had any credibility that I've seen is 8% coming from the FBI, but that is only the number of coming from police agencies that are reporting the ones that they have specifically found to be false, not just unfounded, but false. And
that's the thing. Often when a woman makes an allegation and the police decide not to follow through, it's never registered as a false allegation. I mean, I've got one up in Queensland recently where I interviewed the mother of a boy who was accused, an 18-year-old, and I mean, it was an amazing case because she, the accuser, sort of did a terrible job during the court case and was proved to be lying on all sorts of aspects of the case. She was found to have DNA from 2 other men in her vagina on the night in question, not the man who was being accused. And when this young man was exonerated, left the courthouse, the jury was standing there applauding him, which is an extraordinary thing. And what's really interesting is, I mean, of course, they're trying to get the accuser up on perjury charges, but of course the police aren't interested. That's always the problem. The police don't follow through on false allegations.
Oh, they will suffer the wrath of feminists if they do that. Just like Dr. Kalin, his research came out about 30%, similar to what the Air Force study initially found before they brought it up to 60. So I happen to think that the number really probably is somewhere between 20 and 30. That's just my thinking, but it could actually be higher. I certainly don't think it's lower than that.
Mark, if you could give me a couple of the references for these key studies, could you do that? We'll put it up with this when we post this podcast.
Sure.
That'd be really good. Yeah. What about the Title IX, the campus cases? Are you involved in any of them?
I've been involved a little bit, but we have other people with NCFM that are very involved, like Greg Josephchuk out there in the Carolinas. He runs our Carolinas chapter. He has done a tremendous amount of work on that. I mean, he brought male victims of false accusation, falsely accused college men, to a meeting with Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, now is synthetic. And had them speak, and she even, apparently she was very moved by it. And so, she made a lot of changes, and we've helped a lot of men file complaints, a lot of them.
I gather there are something like 500 in the pipeline. I know that the figures I was looking at, over 200 of cases of where the universities, the colleges have lost cases taken for failure to protect their legal rights. Yeah,
a very large number of the lawsuits. I have heard 70%. I can't say I've confirmed that number, but I've been told about 70% of the lawsuits are winning by the men.
I just want to quickly tell people, that's my big battle, of course. I've been out on university campuses for the last year, speaking out about what's happening here in Australia, about the fact that our universities, in America, it was Obama who used the anti-discrimination laws to argue universities had to get involved in this area. In Australia, it's all obviously feminist orchestrated, and they've used our university regulator. We've got an organisation that is in charge of regulating our universities, and they put out a sort of order. They circulated a notice to the universities telling them that they had to do more about sexual assault and harassment, and the result of that has been universities have got involved in adjudicating rape. That's as simple as. I'm in the business. I'm just about to write something about this. I had a big win last week because we had one of our senators. I've just put it up on my ThinkSpot blog. One of our senators grilling the head of this organisation, pointing out that they've set up. So the universities, as a result of what this regulator required, have taken it upon themselves to set up regulations for adjudicating rape that have not one word about the rights of the accused. And she did a fantastic job grilling these bureaucrats who are just squirming in their seats when she points out, I'll send it to you. It's really fascinating. So I'm on the warpath to expose what's going on here. And we have some key people in government now who are wanting to help with this, which is pretty exciting. Anyway, so it goes on.
Well, I absolutely love your work, Bettina. You just have guts, and I don't want to say balls, I guess.
I'm happy to have balls. Who wouldn't want to have balls, I must say.
Like the AC/DC song, She's Got Balls, and they're an Australian band. So, it's
so many areas. But what I was pleased to hit, Mark, I noticed you were speaking about the fact that we're getting some big wins internationally. You were talking about the UN and the European Union. Tell me about what's happening there in terms of anti-discrimination.
Well, a couple of things did happen, and this is one of the things I think that people need to consider if there is specific sex discrimination against men written into the law, and you've tried everything in your country all the way to the top court and you've gotten nowhere. In Israel, the fathers' rights groups actually were successful when they went to the UN and showed the UN that Israel still was practicing this tender years doctrine that was specifically discriminating against fathers. And the UN decisions are not binding on member nations so much, but they still have impact. And the UN chastised Israel for that and said this is wrong. This is discrimination against fathers. In Germany.
Can I just wait on Mark on that? It's very relevant to Australia because this tender years doctrine, which is about the fact that the feminists have argued that it's not appropriate for fathers to have any overnight care of children, preschoolers and babies. Children under 3, and that was all orchestrated by Australian psychologist called Jennifer McIntosh, who did this shonky research where she claimed it was detrimental to the child to be separated from the mother for even any overnight in that young age group. And that research was influential around the world. I know it was one of the issues that they were arguing about in relation to this Israel case. And it's all, and this is, and it's an amazing thing because this Australian psychologist's work was called out. There was a Richard Warshak, who's a famous psychiatrist who's worked a lot on parental alienation in particular. He got together a group of 110 world experts on child psychology and so on, and they looked at this whole issue of the tender years of the overnight care of infants, and they called out this McIntosh research as being as saying it should never have been used to influence social science policy. And so Australia is at the heart of that Israel case, which I think is fascinating. But go on, tell us about Germany and the EU.
Well, going back to the UN for a moment, I forgot to mention that the basis of the ruling was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that forbids sex discrimination based on sex. Of course, it creates a couple of exceptions for military and for prisoners, who are, of course, about 90% men. But there is still that law, and they did, or that principle, and they did apply that in chastising Israel. In Germany, there was a law that said men who were not married have absolutely no custody rights over their children unless mom says it's okay.
Yeah.
So it's basically a maternal gatekeeping law. And fathers' rights and men's rights activists in Germany got the UN Human Rights Court, the EU Human Rights Court, to actually put a stop to that, because that decision is binding. And they said this is discrimination. So we've seen at least two sort of international law cases like that where the courts of human rights did stand up for the men. Now, I don't think we have I don't think they're that strongly on our side, but I think it is something people should consider once they've tried everything in their country. You have to first have exhausted every remedy in your country. You've gone all the way to the top court, and you just have nothing else left that you can do in the court system.
Yeah.
Before you go to the UN and probably the EU as well. But it is something to consider when you've got nothing else. And I've been talking to men's rights activists in India about this, because they're considering taking some things up to the UN.
Yeah.
Of course, we know there's a lot of things going on there. So it is something to consider.
Yeah.
It should be last resort.
It's all just about getting these issues out there, really, isn't it? And getting people to start to think about them. Because what I'm finding, I'm finding, of course, it's not just men who are watching what's happening here. There are so many women who are really concerned about our laws being so firmly tilted in favor of women and against men. I mean, I'm sure you hear that too.
Yeah. And I see, and I've seen women get screwed by some of these laws too, sort of indirectly. Yeah, definitely.
But also, luckily, most men who are done over in our courts have women who support them, who have mothers, have sisters, have, whatever. And I'm hearing from more and more women concerned about all of these issues, which I think is very encouraging. It's so much easier for women to speak out about what's going on than it is for men. And that's where you're very brave, Mark. I'm sure you must have got a lot of flack along the way.
Yeah, definitely, here and there, hit pieces, things like that. But, and what you just said made me think of a guy I've recently, and still I'm representing this guy was a victim of, Alex Baker, a victim here in L.A. of his ex-wife impersonated him and would apply for credit cards and things like that. And he was a musician. In fact, he played keyboards for the Supremes and for REO Speedwagon. And so she was doing all these things like that, and the law has expanded domestic violence definition so much in the U.S. and California that almost anything, even just any kind of disturbing the other person's peace, can be considered domestic violence. Yeah. And it even specifically spells out that that impersonation is a form of domestic violence. So these courts put a restraining order against him because he filed a number of lawsuits against her, some of which have been found meritorious. And the judge said, well, it doesn't matter if they're meritorious or not. And I wasn't representing him at the time, but I saw the transcript. The judge actually said that. It doesn't matter if it's meritorious or not. You're filing too many lawsuits against her, and because there are all these fights about royalties that they have, and her impersonating him, signing his name on contracts, and then taking his royalties. So now he's got this restraining order against him for filing lawsuits, but when he tries to get a restraining order against her in a different court, mind you, but against her for impersonating him, which the law specifically says is domestic violence if it's against a partner or ex-partner, the judge said, no, I don't see how this is domestic violence. I don't see how this is impersonation and financial abuse. I don't see how. I read this, at this time I was representing him. I read the statute right into the transcript in open court, and the judge just said, no, I don't see it. So we're going to appeal that, but it's just unbelievable. Even when you have this expansion of the definition of domestic violence and supposed to be gender neutral, they're still applying it in a very sexist way between men and women.
We've got a really exciting development here too in Australia on that issue, where a lot of the domestic violence accusations are coming about in the process of family separation. Women are using this as a weapon to get the man turfed out of the house, to get him denied contact with the kids, and to get a greater hunk of the assets. I mean, there's enormous advantage for women in having and we now have had the government has determined that there's going to be a parliamentary inquiry into the family court, which includes specifically addressing this issue of false accusations.
Wow!
And perjury.
How did you get that done? Congratulations.
Well, we've got a very brave politician called Pauline Hanson, who's outspoken on a whole range of issues and hugely unpopular with the whole, chattering classes. Yeah. They hate her. And she's been sticking her neck out on this issue for years and years and years, and she's deputy chair of this committee. And the feminists have been hilarious in the last few weeks, desperately trying to get this inquiry closed down because there's so much of the evidence coming out about the false allegations. I had a chief inspector of police last year came to me and gave me an interview about all of this, where he talked about the role of the police in having to go into houses where women are clearly making false allegations, and these poor policemen have no choice but to remove the man from the home when they know it's very likely based on no evidence. I mean, as you say, you don't need any evidence. You can just say, I'm afraid something could happen to me. It's about to all blow up, I hope, in Australia, because we'll at least see some of this evidence paraded before the public. And I'm very involved in trying to get good people, to appear before this committee so we can at least show what's going on here. The battles continue, Mark. I think we better go. I'm going to organise to speak to you again. There's so many issues we haven't talked about, but I think this has been a very good starting point, and really happy to have a chance to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. Can I say one last thing really fast, really quickly?
Go, yes.
I love hearing what's going on in other countries in the men's rights movement, and so I am following that, and I'm just really ecstatic about those gains you've had, and other. I love hearing about in Latin America, we're hearing things too. In Costa Rica, the men's rights activists actually got the president to promise he'll create a commission on men's issues. And so in Mexico, the Red Pill film aired at the Community Cultural Center in Tijuana, and I was invited down there to speak as a panelist with an interpreter. My friend came and interpreted, and it was a really good event. A lot of people were there. So from what I hear, the Red Pill has gone viral in Latin America. So I just really love to hear how this is a global movement, and it's going on all over the place. Thank you very much, Bettina, and Scott, thank you for all your work, everything you do, and for having me on.
It's lovely to talk to you. everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.